Well, thanks very much for that kind invitation, and indeed the invitation to come and speak. It is a strangely surreal thing, precisely, to be just a half brick's throw from somewhere where, dear God, almost 40 years ago, I turned up. So obviously, thank you for that reminder of human mortality. But nonetheless, it's a useful reminder generally that history matters. And history matters particularly in the context of Russia, and modern Russia and Putin's Russia. I mean, this is the thing. Putin seems to fancy himself to be something of a historian. I don't know if anyone saw that rather surreal interview he had with Tucker Carlson, the American journalist, commentator, whatever, in which an increasingly bemused and almost terrified Tucker Carlson, having asked a question about Ukraine and receiving from Putin the answer that, let me just for 30 seconds to a minute tell you about the historical context, who proceeded to present a 30-minute exegesis about his view of why Russia and Ukraine were basically the same country. Putin loves history. Putin is a really, really bad historian. His lengthy essay precisely on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians really would not scrape a pass, quite frankly, if anyone would actually be willing to give Vladimir Vladimirovich a grade. He suffers from all the usual amateur historians' worst sins, cherry-picking historical anecdotes and events to suit his argument, going for the ones that are convenient and ignoring the inconvenient. And he himself said at one point that what Russia needs is precisely a history that is simple and of a single narrative. If only history were like that. But it says something about precisely how he uses history in the course of his nation-building, state-building project, and as part of his general statecraft. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit, first of all, about the role of history in Putin's Russia, before then flipping it round to then look specifically at Putin, his own historical parallels, because he very much likes to compare himself with a series of Russian figures, and generally, as it were, the historical greats of Russian history, and then actually unpick those a little and see what it can say. Because obviously, look, history is not a predictive instrument. History is a very imperfect guide to the future. But what it can do is precisely do two things. One is give us a sense of possible options and alternatives that may evolve, but also the way people think and talk about history tells us something about them and their understanding of the world, their view of the world. So, why is history really important? First of all, because basically Putin needs a national mythology. What else has he got? I mean, there's no more Marxism, Leninism. I mean, although obviously Marxism, Leninism had died long before the end of the Soviet Union. His kind of inchoate brand of nationalism with a little side order of populism, frankly, scarcely sort of really has much traction with the Russian people. So he needs to find something to fill that gaping vacuum, lest people notice that essentially this is an authoritarian kleptocracy. I mean, look, I have, let me be perfectly frank, an axe to grind here. In June 2022, I was in the first batch of Brits who were banned indefinitely from Russia for our notional Russophobic tendencies. And that really bugs me. It doesn't just bug me because it means I can't go back. I mean, to be honest, even if I could go back at the moment, given that kidnapping seems to have become a tactic of the Russian state, I'm not sure if I would. But being accused of Russophobia and so forth, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest Russophobe of all is sitting in the Kremlin. The man who actually, not just for himself, but for his mates, allows them to embezzle on an industrial scale while feeding more and more Russians into a war that, frankly, most of them don't really understand and is basically sort of shattering Russia's place in the world. I will stop editorializing on that particular point. But anyway, he needs something to justify it, because he can't basically rely on his old social contract, because his old social contract was really quite simple and also quite effective. It was, certainly in the early years of Putin's, God help us all, 24 years in direct and indirect power over Russia, it was essentially this. To the Russian people, he offered them stability, but above all, prosperity. You stay out of politics. You let us run the country, and life will get steadily better. It'll be a bit better next year, and it'll be much better for when your kids are around. So this was the deal. And quite frankly, most Russians were pretty willing to accept that. I mean, after all, what had they been through? The slow, shabby decay of the Soviet Union, the anarchic mess of the 1990s, in which 0.00 whatever 1% of Russians became obscenely wealthy, and most Russians lived in, frankly, pretty dire straits. I mean, those are years it was actually quite embarrassing to be a Westerner travelling to Russia, because I was, to a degree, insulated by the fact that exactly I had hard currency and so forth. I was not one of the pensioners queuing up outside metro stations, desperately selling anything they had to eke out pensions that were now pretty much meaningless. While at the same time, Mercedes-Benz were selling more bulletproof limousines in Russia than in the rest of the world put together. A time when essentially it was certainly sort of, I'm trying to think, when I was there in 1993 at one point, and essentially the time I was there, entirely coincidentally I should add, coinciding with a spate of car bombings in Moscow, such that on average organised crime car bombings were happening once a week while I was there. And then it all tapered off when I left, but I tried not to take that personally. You know, you've been through that, and now all of a sudden someone's saying, just sit back, relax, just do your thing, live your life. You can buy a new fridge freezer, and actually there will be food to put in the fridge freezer. The 2000s, after all, were times of plenty. Not thanks to Putin, frankly. He was just, as he has often been in his political career, unexpectedly lucky. He happened to be coming to power at a time when anyway the economy was stabilizing, and also high global prices for hydrocarbons basically meant that he had money to spare. So his mates could steal, he could build up his military, and there was enough left over for ordinary Russians to live a good life. Well, for some years, even before the 2022 invasion, that has no longer really been the case. Russians no longer feel that they can be certain that things are going to get better. So that element of the social contract was broken. And he's tried to replace that with the sense of Russia being a beleaguered fortress and that everyone has to sort of band together. That hasn't really taken. So he needs something. He needs glory. He needs trumpets to drown out the sound of the grumbling. And also, both to attempt to unite the nation. Remember, this is a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional land empire, or built on the bones, shall we say, of a land empire. I think it's very difficult. Russia has a tendency to challenge our vocabulary and our neat descriptions of what it is. Is it an empire? Kind of. It was. Is it still? One could argue that either way. But nonetheless, it is in many ways divided. It does need something to bring it all together, and also to support his own status, his own legitimacy. I mean, yes, Putin has this strange determination to stay within the letter, usually, if not the spirit of the law. Hence, for example, after his first 2 terms as president, he technically stood down in order to observe term limits, but he installed his sock puppet president, Dmitry Medvedev, to kind of perform the role in theory while he sat in the Prime Minister's office and still basically ran the country. So, often there's this thing of, this is why he has elections. He clearly regards elections these days as a massive pain in the backside. It involves you actually having to talk to the Russian people, for God's sake. But nonetheless, he goes through the pretense, and then, lo and behold, announces an 87% victory. When there's been some interesting kind of number crunching, people who have skills way, way different and beyond my own, that suggests that maybe fully half of all the votes that Putin claimed were either fabricated or transferred from, actually originally had been cast for someone else. So he goes through the bother of having an election campaign and everything else, even while cheating it. So he clearly feels the need for the kind of legitimating rituals that elections are, and needs history to supplement that. And so for a long time, we have had a very strong state dependence on history, state commitment to history. I mean, on one level, I can only applaud it. I mean, I think the idea of giving historians medals, which happens in Russia, to be an entirely admirable one. The level of support that is given to history publishing, films that are drawing on historical themes and so forth, great, absolutely wonderful. Until you appreciate the degree to which it's the right kind of history that you have to write. That said, if I was a Russian, I'm sure I'd be entirely cynical and write the right kind of history. That's another matter. And it really came to me when in 2014, in what's called the Exhibition of Economic Achievements, VDNK, they've opened this brand new, glitzy, multimedia exhibition, Россия, моя история, Russia, my history. And it purported to tell the story of Russia through all sorts of nice, fancy, modern, glitzy, high-tech means. And it was really clear what kind of history was being promoted. For example, at one point, there's a great big map of Russia in the early medieval era, just before the invasion by the Mongols, which basically meant that for 2 centuries, Russia was under Mongol dominion. And splashed across that map, which showed all the different numerous principalities of the Rus. Anyway, splashed across that map was the word atomization. And the narrative made it absolutely clear. Russia was divided, therefore Russia was prey to foreign invaders. Not exactly a very subtle message. But nonetheless, that's exactly the point. It's about creating the sense that Russia has historically always been under threat, that only a strong, unified central government with a strong, determined leader can actually guarantee Russia's security, sovereignty, and indeed integrity. And lo and behold, who might that be at the moment? Well, obviously, it's Vladimir. But again, that depends on, once again, this cherry-picking history, ignoring all the wonderful subtleties and details and intricacies of the real history. It's about basically picking the bits that suit your narrative. And particularly to do that, to try and do 2 things. First of all, to create a new nationalism that elides across all the usual division points. If you look, for example, at Russian military history, a particular area of interest of mine, you will find exhibitions about the great Russian commanders that essentially will set Tsarist commanders, people like Zhukov and Konev, the great marshals of the Second World War, right next to Soviet commanders, right next to Tsarist commanders, who in some cases were actually fought against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, and all the way back to medieval princes like Alexander Nevsky of film fame. The fact that one set were wearing red stars on their caps, another one Tsarist double-headed eagles, and another one didn't have caps at all but helmets, none of that matters. The point is, it's to create this sense of a single unbroken historical continuity that leads to the present day. I mean, this is Whig history with bayonets. This is that sense that today, Russia is at the apogee, at the highest point of its development. And this is what all of Russia's history has been leading it to, inexorably. History becomes catechism. It doesn't become something that you debate and discuss and explore and see what else can be found and whether or not that new information challenges the old notion. No. It becomes dogma. I know I'm mixing my religious metaphors, but you get the point. And by doing so, and with all the kind of state support for the right kind of history, it creates history entrepreneurs. Now this fits into actually how Putin's system works. I've called it an adhocracy. And then in fact, particularly if you're at a senior position, your real job isn't necessarily the same as what your job title is. Your job is to basically do for the boss what the boss needs doing today, and to try and predict what Putin may want tomorrow. Because the real currency of today's Russia is not the ruble, it's not even the dollar or the euro or the yuan, it is favour in Putin's court. So you have a lot of people who are basically thinking, okay, so we now know what sort of history is the official history. How can we cash in on that? So you have, for example, a whole range of historical pundits who are trying to essentially find new ways of packaging information, packaging the old narratives to fit the new line, or to create sort of grand narratives around it that seem to fit what Putin needs. And often the point is the regime will pick up and put down these individuals as the circumstances need. A classic example is a philosopher by the name of Alexander Dugin. Now, Western journalists love Dugin, or they love to hate Dugin. But the point is, he speaks English, but with the right kind of Russian accent. He's got a big bushy beard. He talks in the sort of high-flown, pseudo-philosophical sort of narratives, forms that people think that, foreign philosophy historians ought to speak in. And he also is, in many ways, barking mad. All of those commend him. I mean, he's sometimes called Putin's brain and such like. And he's very much created this notion of something he calls Eurasianism. The idea that Russia is a distinct and unique culture within the world that draws on the best of Europe and Asia, but is separate therefrom. And at one point, for example, in 2014, when basically the Russians were toying with going all in on an undeclared war in Ukraine's Donbass region, there was a sort of, in some ways, Putin was still very much on the fence as to whether to go all in or not. At that point, Dugin's philosophies suddenly became convenient. And suddenly, Dugin's star arose like a meteor. He was on every single TV talk show and such like. His books were, getting sort of front table billing at Russian bookshops. I mean, it was quite fascinating because I was living in Moscow at the time. And it was, just suddenly, you would go into one of the big sort of great bookshops of Moscow, Dom Knigi or Globus, and all of a sudden, where before there was a sort of table of, romantic fiction or something, all of a sudden now there'd be a whole table groaning with Dugin's lengthy pseudo-philosophical tracts. And that was good for him. Within about 4 or 5 months, though, government policy had shifted. Dugin was no longer convenient. All of a sudden, the invitations on telly rather sort of dried up. His position at Moscow State University began to come under question. And it's not that he'd done anything wrong. He was just an entrepreneur who had hit the right moment with the right message, but then the needs of the state had moved on. But that doesn't matter. They can jettison Dugin, he'll still be there because the state is the only game in town. But the point is there's always other people who want to be the next Dugin, who will be packaging all kinds of nice new ways of looking at history, hoping that they are the ones who are catching the zeitgeist of tomorrow, that it's what the state will want tomorrow. And it's not just individual academics and scholars and pundits, it's also institutions. They've all got into the history game. The Russian Orthodox Church, which is, I've sometimes said that really we ought to be calling it Rosbog, assuming it's like the kind of the Russian state corporation of religion, because it basically is so tied to the Kremlin, and it is, some would regard it as corrupt. But nonetheless, it certainly has a whole variety of really rather unexpected concessions, economic concessions, tax exemptions and the like, and a very, very large business arm. and a patriarch who said that Putin was a miracle sent from God. But anyway, I mean, you know, but they've got into, again, attempts to basically package Russian history to show that the Russian Orthodox Church has always been the central defender of both the state and the people. I mean, that would have come to a lot of surprise to many Russian people in the past. The army has sort of, again, moved in to the military history and through that, the wider historical realms. Again, all of them trying to cash in on the fact that Putin is looking for the right historical narratives. And it all came together with Ukraine, with the war in Ukraine, the need to justify this essentially imperial adventure, this attempt to try and prove that Ukraine is not a real country, the Ukrainians are not a real people. Sure, one can argue that certainly eastern Ukraine is very different from western Ukraine, that eastern Ukraine, you know, has spent more of its time under Russian control than the West, and that western Ukraine spent much of its time under Polish-Lithuanian control or whatever. But the point is, history is not destiny. I mean, if it was on that basis, frankly, we all ought to be still regarding ourselves as subservient to Rome. But the Roman Empire is gone, and it was a period in the history of Britain and of Europe, and then it moves on. It's one of the geological layers on which we build. Well, the same is true of Ukraine. I mean, it's no more true, as the Russians say, that Ukraine has never been a country, as it is for those, you know, Ukrainian nationalists who say that Ukraine has never really been part of Russia. It varies. But the point is, there was a need to justify, to explain, to try and create a narrative that says this is why Russia is doing what it's doing, and this is why it's right to be doing what it's doing, and this is why Russians ought to believe in it. There's now no room for middle ground. Putin's made it clear, you're a patriot or you're a traitor. And patriotism is defined by accepting the right narratives. So look, that's the context. Why Putin, a man who likes history without understanding history, thinks in those terms. And clearly he has a certain fascination, maybe even an obsession, with his historical legacy. I mentioned the entirely laudable practice of giving state awards to historians. I mean, alas, it's not just historians, it's also other scholars. But nonetheless, I mean, certainly before COVID, things very much changed after COVID, but before COVID, on the whole, Putin would staff out the giving of the awards to most academics. Historians, though, he would often actually do himself. And I heard this from someone I know who's a historian at Moscow State University, who said almost invariably, when he did so, he would ask the historian in question, who's just about to get his, you know, nice pale blue sash and medal or whatever else, in 100 years' time, how will they be writing about me? Now, point one, what an awkward question to be asked by the virtual dictator of a country who we know has people poisoned and everything else. But point two, it also, I think, gives us an interesting insight into kind of where his head has been at for a long time. This sense of his historic position. And we see that in his writings and in his speeches. In that, you know, he's constantly calling back to his notion of historical events, but particularly he's also placing himself in the context of the great role of Russia's state-building heroes. He has paralleled himself with Peter the Great. Peter the Great, who physically towered over his fellows, which is not something one could say about Putin. I mean, I know a heightist joke is not very sophisticated, and in Rishi Sunak's Britain, it's maybe not right. But anyway, nonetheless, it is what it is. Who else has he paralleled himself with? Catherine the Great, who incidentally was German, and also was actually, you know, a very sophisticated thinker. Who else? Nicholas I. Now, I have a faint soft spot for Nicholas I, despite the fact that he happened to be a martinet and an autocrat who led his armies to crush the sort of freedom-loving revolutions of 1848 in Europe. But apart from that, the thing about Nicholas I that Putin talks about is precisely that he was a man unyielding and unbending in his determination to do what was right by Russia. maybe. Who else has Putin paralleled himself with? Pyotr Stolypin, who was not a monarch, unusually, but actually prime minister. He was the prime minister who came into power during the so-called 1905 revolution, which wasn't really a revolution as we understand it. It was more a simultaneous array of risings and protests and mutinies. And he crushed the 1905 revolution with sufficient brutality that in Russian slang, a hangman's noose is still called a Stolypin necktie. And the railway wagons, which in the days of Stalin's Gulag, would take the prisoners to their distant, miserable destinations, were called Stolypin wagons. So there you go, talking about place in history. But nonetheless, Stolypin was also actually a phenomenally, I think, sort of far-sighted figure who attempted to genuinely reform the basis of the imperial Russian system through its economy. And through its economy, because he understood that actually you needed to create a class of prosperous rural yeomen, in effect, on whom the basis for genuine economic modernization would be. So, a man who was sufficiently sort of foresighted to actually try and change Russia, which may explain why he was assassinated, possibly with the connivance of the Tsar, but we don't know that for certain. And the last figure that Putin has not so much paralleled himself with, because he's, I think, aware that there's a certain amount of greater complexity, shall we say, on this point, but he certainly has allowed other people to parallel him too, and that's Joseph Stalin. But of course, not the Joseph Stalin of the purges, but the Joseph Stalin who held the Soviet Union together and led it to victory in the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War. It's quite interesting and is also horrifying looking at the various circumlocutions that you find in Russian textbooks now about what happened in the 1930s, that period in which millions ended up dragged into labour camps, worked to death, shot in the back of the head, or whatever. That's often described as, and the most extreme one I ever saw, which burned itself in my mind, was over-enthusiasm. That is unusually extreme, but nonetheless, again, essentially there's been an attempt to paper over that part of history, and so even with Stalin, it's Stalin the victorious and the successful. Now, the thing is, again, as I said, I don't think Putin understands history. I don't think he understands these parallels particularly well either. So let me actually go through them and just explore what all of them can perhaps tell us. Peter the Great. I don't really like Peter the Great, personally. I don't know. There's, for some reason, he's just not my kind of chap. He was very much a man of his hands. He was a practical ruler. He wanted to learn skills. He was also monstrously self-indulgent. For example, when he decided he was going to learn how to be a dentist, he liked accumulating skills, which is worthwhile. But on the other hand, when he was sort of training himself to be a dentist, he required the members of his court to be his guinea pigs. Those were the days. That's when being a monarch means something. I can't imagine Charles being able to get any of his courtiers to allow him to sort of take the pliers to their molars. But the point is, Peter the Great, there's no question that he put himself into the sort of the projects that he had, whether it was building a navy. He led his so-called Great Embassy, which basically was a trip around Europe, particularly to try and gain allies, which he wasn't very successful at, but also to get the wherewithal with which to build Russia's first navy. He was obsessed with boats and so forth. So, in particular, he went to the Netherlands, which at the time was, again, sort of one of the great shipbuilding countries, which is one interesting one, which is one of the reasons why so many Russian words for anything to do with ships and sailing actually are rooted in Dutch. And those that are not rooted in Dutch, many of them are rooted in English, because he also came to England for the same purpose. He looked in on Parliament, and then decided that he said that democracy is not right for the Russian people. And he so comprehensively trashed the house in which he was staying that literally every single window was broken by the time he left. But the main thing about Peter the Great is, I mean, he was indeed an empire builder. He was an enthusiastic warmonger, quite frankly, particularly wars against the Swedes, sort of battle for sort of control over northeastern Europe and the Baltic. But he was successful, which I think immediately is going to set him out from Putin. But also he had a very clear sense of the limitations. For example, as I mentioned, that he was very keen on building a navy, and he did. I mean, he built Russia's first navy. But on the other hand, he knew that however shiny and new it looked, it was not backed by the kind of skills and leadership traditions that the great seafaring powers had. So, for example, I mean, yes, he would engage with the Swedes, who were at the time a very serious military power, initially just with trying to deny them the opportunity to launch attacks, and then increasingly also supporting amphibious operations. But when a British Navy, or English Navy flotilla came into the Baltics, actually at that point Peter the Great pulled in his horns, because he appreciated that basically at that time you did not mess with the Royal Navy. Those were also the days. So it's this clear sense of a man who was bullish, aggressive, self-indulgent, but also appreciated the limits. And one of the key things of that was he insisted on actually experiencing. I mean, when he wanted to learn about warfare, he joined sort of regiments that he'd set up, initially as a bombardier. So he actually loaded the cannon and went through the whole experience of having more senior officers shout at him and such like. When he was building the navy, he actually insisted on being part of the process of actually literally physically building the ships and then sailing and listening to the imported admirals or naval captains that they hired from the Dutch and the English and so forth. He actually cared about what was really happening. That's proven to be one of the absolutely crucial flaws of Vladimir Putin. The degree to which he has chosen, and it's a choice, he has insulated himself within a bubble of cronies and yes men. Now look, it doesn't matter if you're a Tsar, a General Secretary, or a President of the Russian Federation, you will end up with a court, especially if you're in power for a long period of time. Putin, though, almost seems to have sought that. Remember, in 2015, sitting down to have a cuppa with a recently retired Russian spy who said, "We have learned you do not bring bad news to the Tsar's table." In other words, even then, 2015, even at that point, the spies, the people who are meant to be precisely the ones who provide the so-called best truth, who provide the real inside information about what's going on in the world, they have learned that you do not say anything to challenge Putin's prejudices and his assumptions about the world. And we saw this play out in the invasion of Ukraine, where he genuinely seems to have thought that the Ukrainians, this non-people from this non-country, would grumble and shrug, but accept the imposition of a puppet regime in Kyiv in a matter of days. So much so that some of the soldiers who were being sent to take Kyiv were instructed at the last minute to take their parade uniforms so that they could have a victory march down the Krishchatyk, the main street in Kyiv. Now, the thing is, of course, there are many people in Putin's circle who knew better. His Minister of Defense, his Chief of the General Staff, his heads of his spy agencies and such like. Lots of people who knew better. And we know that because of other things that they've said. But no one was willing or able to say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, it's not going to be like that. And that hubris and that willful insulation from reality distinguishes himself from Peter the Great. Catherine the Great was in many ways the Empress of Spin. I mean, she sold a picture of Russia to Western European, particularly sort of philosophers and the like, about Russia that was modernizing, that was liberal, that every peasant had sort of ample food and everything else. And because no one at the time was thinking, why don't I pop over to Russia and just double check this? On the whole, people were willing to accept this. But again, this is it. She had an awareness of the degree to which she was, let's be honest, lying to the outside world. Again, Putin, in many ways, he has spun the Russian Federation. You go to Moscow, and it's an amazing, shiny, well-working, cosmopolitan European city. Quite frankly, if Moscow Mayor Sobyanin was standing for Mayor of London, I think everyone should have voted for him too. But the point is, that is Putin's window on the West. You go out to the provinces and you get a very, very different experience of what Russia is like. But Putin doesn't go out into the provinces anymore. I mean, he scarcely travels he scarcely travels to Moscow, frankly, from his palaces, let alone anywhere more down market. If you're going to spin, but know when you're spinning. Putin seems to have basically built his assumptions on the nice, shiny Russia, ranging from its armies to its cities, that was presented to him in the outside world, rather than anything else. Nicholas I. See, the reason I have a soft spot for Nicholas I is that ultimately this was a man who believed, yes, he believed fiercely in discipline amongst those around him. And look, he was a martinet. He believed that, as it were, parade discipline made for a good army rather than anything else. Many, many flaws. But he also believed in discipline for himself, and he was aware of how corrosive was the corruption that at the time, times don't necessarily change, ran through imperial Russia from top to bottom. He said to his son, I believe you and I are the only two people in Russia who do not steal. He started desperately trying to find people, honest people, as well as efficient people he could promote. I mean, this is a period where, for example, we saw a whole slew of Baltic German aristocrats, Baltic states being at the time part of the empire, who were being promoted into the imperial system, simply because actually Nicholas didn't trust the Russians. So he was trying to find, well, let's find some people who might be outsiders, who might actually be able to cleanse this system. He failed. Ultimately, Nicholas I, who was personally brave in the face of battle, but he never was brave enough to actually grasp the nettle of domestic reform. Serfdom, for example, land slavery. He knew full well that it was both a moral evil as well as deeply economically dysfunctional. Because we know that he set up all sorts of secret committees to try and work out how can we resolve the serfdom issue and get rid of serfdom. And because all of them came back with various plans, but necessarily acknowledging, though, that it will be deeply disruptive and dangerous, he always backed away from it. So, he was in that respect weak. But nonetheless, the point was that he realized the degree to which corruption was in some ways the sort of the fatal cancer eating at the Russian Empire. Putin, I know it's going to shock you to hear this, Putin has only facilitated that corruption throughout his period, and he still is today. Stolypin was a reformer, but what else did he say? He said, give me 20 years of peace and you will not know Russia. In other words, Stolypin desperately wanted to keep Russia out of conflicts so that, precisely, it could reform and develop. Putin? Of Putin's 24 years in direct and indirect power, only 3 of those years has Russia not been at war, whether declared or undeclared, domestic or foreign. So, is he Stalin? Nah, he wishes. Now, if I'm going to give my kind of parallels, I kind of oscillate between Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader through 1970s into the very early 80s, or Ivan the Terrible. And in some ways, at the moment, Putin is building almost a recreation of the old sort of 1970s Soviet Union, of the arms race and Cold War era, massive and in the long term unsustainable defense spending, increasing ossifying gerontocracy. Putin's 71, most of his cronies are again between 68 and 74. Technically speaking, you're meant to, it is required that you retire at the age of 70, but a presidential decree does wonders to keep your cronies in position. This is a system which has its strengths but can collapse. But, let me conclude with this. Ultimately, I still think that Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, is the best parallel. Now, first of all, We should know, terrible. The Russian word Grozny, it means terrible, but not in the sense of really bad, but in the sense of awesome. But on the other hand, if you called him Ivan the Awesome, he does begin to sound like a kind of Californian surfer. So, but the interesting thing about Ivan the Terrible, for all that he was a ghastly excuse for a human being, who incidentally killed his own son and heir in a fit of rage, but one can almost divide Ivan's reign into two halves. The first half, Ivan was an actually very successful state builder. He understood the need for institutions. This was an era of where we had the beginnings of the need for mass armies. Mass armies mean you need to have a lot of money, and standing armies at that. And to get money out of a system, basically states are engines to raise and spend money through tax. So, he needed institutions. And so many of the current sort of basic elements within the Russian bureaucracy date their beginnings back to Ivan's reign. The ambassador's office, precursor of today's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the banditry office, Ministry of Internal Affairs. This is a period of the codification of laws and such like, not because he was a good person, but because he understood that actually he needed a working state, and he built it. Unfortunately, he also was going increasingly mad. Paranoid, probably actually also deeply sort of sick. And in his second half, he almost tore apart every bit of the state that he built. He became, firstly, willing to engage in deeply dangerous foreign adventures. Secondly, he increasingly turned against his own people and his own aristocracy, elevating a handful of cronies and more or less giving them free rein to raid and kill whom they wanted. And he destroyed his heir, so there was no succession. So that when he did die, the country slid into a period of chaos and anarchy known as the Smuta, the time of troubles. That, to me, is actually the historical parallel. Because, like it or not, the first 2 terms of Putin's presidency, yes, they were marked by all kinds of corruption and brutality, but they actually also performed certain necessary functions. They brought the country back from the brink of collapse, and they were periods, for most Russians, of relative security, stability, and also there were periods in which, for example, corruption was slowly being brought under control, at least in terms of the sort of ordinary person's experience. And if he had stopped in 2008 at the end of his second presidential term, I think those historians 100 years hence would have been relatively kind to him. A bad man who did a necessary job, even if sometimes in bad ways. But he couldn't. He had to come back. He had convinced himself he was indispensable. And his more recent presidential terms have instead seen him in many ways eating through the muscle mass of Russia that was built up in those early years. I don't think Russia will have a time of troubles when he dies. But could I guarantee that? Sadly not. So in this respect, maybe history is a bit more predictive than we might think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that talk. Very timely, and thank you for extolling the virtues of history and how to use it and how not to use it. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions before I throw it over to our lovely audience, who I will ask to keep the questions fairly brief, for we are fairly limited on time.
The problem is never the length of the questions, it's the length of the answers.
You spoke earlier about the state of Russian academia and indeed the giving of prizes to Russian historians. What is the state of the historians who don't subscribe so closely to the official party line? Is there a sort of spirit of anti-Putinist, anti-current system historians who write in Russia and are funded by the universities there?
It's a really interesting question. And yes, and it's very, very Soviet in patterns. It's almost like you have to hide your dissent. So maybe what you'll do is you will bury it in what looks like a terribly tedious, I know it's hard to believe historical articles being tedious, but some sort of terribly tedious thing about, demographics in Ivanovo region in the 1840s. Because you know full well that very few people are going to read it, but actually if you dig into it, it may well be precisely about the demographic impact of corruption affecting, responses to disease or something like that. So you bury it, or you find ways of framing it in Aesopian terms, so that you're not writing about Russia, but everyone knows you are writing about Russia. And as I said, I mean, what's really striking is precisely the degree to which these are Soviet practices that have somehow managed to kind of re-emerge, encoded in the DNA of those scholars.
Thank you very much. And now I'll move on to ask about, you've obviously spoken a lot about what Putin sees his own place in history as. How does he view people like Volodymyr Zelensky and the war in Ukraine in terms of historical parallels? Does he see this as his great patriotic war? Does he see Zelensky as his Napoleon?
No, I mean, definitely not his Napoleon. I mean, he's extraordinarily dismissive of Zelensky at every moment. And again, that's one of his big mistakes. He's not realizing that actually Zelensky has been an extraordinary asset to Ukraine, both as a sort of symbol to keep the Ukrainians together, but even more effectively actually as an advocate, cajoling, pushing, browbeating the West into supporting Ukraine. But in terms of the actual war in Ukraine, it's quite interesting that if one looks at his rhetoric, it is increasingly becoming his great patriotic special military operation. The idea that Ukraine, and remember, to Putin, this is not just about Ukraine. Ukraine is just one battlefront in a wider struggle with the West. And so absolutely he tries to frame it as this existential struggle for Ukraine's, for Russia's status as a great power and its sovereignty and so forth. So yes, I mean, he's trying to build it up, both in order to big himself up, but also precisely to make it clear as to why Russians need to buckle down and do what they're told and all put their shoulders to the wheel and whatever other cliches I can conjure up. Why this is not just some, imperial adventure in another country. This is a struggle for Russia. It's not really getting much traction, but that's very much his goal.
And you talk about the struggle with the West. In Uzbekistan earlier today, Putin seemed to threaten small territories with dense populations in Europe as a result of the intervention in the invasion of Ukraine. How different does Putin view Eastern Europe to, say, the Stalinist view as a buffer zone? Or does he view it more as that hedgehog in the pants of the West, of the small nations of Eastern Europe as pressure points with which he can use to exert pressure on them?
I mean, first of all, I don't think he was just talking about Central and Eastern Europe when he said that about small countries with dense populations. I think, Britain would also fall within that category. Well, frankly, if you're in Russia, every country is a small country. In the modern era, frankly, territorial buffers do not really work. In an era of high-speed sort of non-contact warfare and, above all, nuclear weapons. So I don't think he sees them in these terms. I mean, for example, Ukraine, it's not actually as if he thinks, well, I need to have Ukraine because I need to stop Romanian tanks from be able to roll into Russian territory. It is because, as far as he's concerned, Ukraine is part of Russia's kind of geopolitical patrimony. And more to the point, his view of a great power is a very 19th century view. And part of the attributes of a great power is that you have a sphere of influence. You have countries who are subordinated to your own. And Ukraine needs to be shown that it does not get the chance to decide for itself. So it's a different kind of notion. It's not quite as sort of crassly sort of military buffer zone-y as Stalin's. If anything, though, it is instead rather more crassly 19th century.
Wonderful. I think I'll throw it over to the audience now. So Stefan's got the throwing cube for whoever wishes to receive it. Take the cube.
Thank you.
Will Putin die peacefully in his bed, age 90?
Age 90, I hope not. Look, I suspect that actually the odds are that mortality will be what brings Putin down. If there's one thing that this system is still pretty good at, it's coup-proofing itself. It's not impossible that he will be toppled, but things would have to get much, much more dangerous. You'd actually have to have the elite thinking, look, either we move against him now or we all end up hanging from a lamppost in Red Square. And as I said, I mean, we're nowhere near that yet. And I don't think Putin can step down now either. I mean, the temptation for any successor to use him as a bargaining chip and present him to The Hague with a bow on him would be just too great. Or else, anyway, he could suspect that is the case. So whether it's age 90, I can cross my fingers and hope not, but nonetheless, I suspect that it will be mortality that takes him.
In the striped shirt in the middle.
I do love the extra jeopardy that this approach brings in.
You mentioned the role of certain institutions, the army, the Orthodox Church, in kind of propping up and legitimizing this, like, Putin's view of Russian history and among other elements of his rule, of course. And I recently finished my dissertation on the Russian state television channel Россия-1's coverage of the Ukraine war and kind of how they legitimate Russia's actions and reinforce this image of Ukraine as an enemy. And I'm interested in how you view the role of today's television pundits, people like Solovyov, Kiselyov, Skabyev, Popov, in promoting this idea of a single historical context, single historical continuity that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are very much the entrepreneurs of the world. I mean, take someone like, if people don't know, particularly Solovyov, who is probably, opinions will vary. For me, he's the most toxic and unpleasant of all the current sort of shouty TV pundits who are, it's a little bit, I don't know, sort of Newsnight meets daytime television. The interesting thing is, first of all, that a lot of what they say is, yes, indeed, meant to support the Putin narrative, but it goes well beyond the official narrative. And I think that's, again, the part of their role, is to say these extraordinary things about why they should detonate a nuclear device in the sea off Britain so that we can all be swept away by a tsunami. So it becomes a kind of deniable threat that Putin can sort of distance himself from and seem vaguely statesmanlike by not repeating. But exactly, they're all almost competing to come up with something even more dramatic and even more extreme and barking mad. The interesting thing is, though, again, if one looks at viewership figures, that this is a turn-off for ordinary Russians. That actually we have seen viewership of TV news and these kind of news-related programming going down. And what do people want? They want soap operas. They want light entertainment. They want to be distracted rather than to be riled up. So although one watches these programs, and I can only commend you for your strong stomach in using it for your dissertation, and it looks like not the 5 minutes of hate or whatever it was from George Orwell, but 45 minutes of hate. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of this is, frankly, for, I think, internal consumption. It's people who are speaking to their own circle, and precisely the TV producers and the people in the presidential administration who, apportion the monies and such like, in order to create a kind of a world, sort of a parallel cinematic reality in which Russia is exactly under threat, but nonetheless, Russia stands tall and is a kind of truly global power. But, good for them. But ordinary Russians just don't seem to be buying it, fortunately.
In the middle.
How has the BBC's Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg, avoided the fate that befell you in 2022?
Well, it could befall me because I was entirely trivial and unimportant. It's interesting that although the Russians have hollowed out the foreign press corps in Russia and continue to do so, Steve's still there, and I think in part it's because he's very good at knowing exactly the line to tiptoe, so that he can actually give proper, he's genuinely reporting the news, but not in that kind of slightly tendentious way that frankly a lot of people do. But also because the Russians, they do not aspire to be North Korea, or at least not yet. It's important to them to actually have people through whom they can from time to time get their messages out as well. When Steve goes and does vox pops with just someone in the streets in Moscow or whatever, it's also showing that Russia is not an entirely militarized society full of rabid demons. So I think it actually also sort of, so long as he doesn't go too far, it also manages to suit the Russians as well to have this person there.
these couple of questions from the front.
I won't get it that far.
There you go.
Thank you. Two questions, if I may.
If they're short.
First question, is it correct to emphasize only on Putin? I mean, the influence of his court, of secret service, of nomenclatura, which survived the 90s. And the second question about future and about teaching and understanding Russian history in the future. Putin is repeating the imperial narratives of Russian Empire and Soviet Empire, mixing them. And I believe that the UK has a huge experience in overcoming such imperial narratives. Do you have any suggestion for future Russian historians how to overcome all these things?
Okay. I mean, in terms of the first one, yeah, absolutely. There are all sorts of other people who matter, but I wasn't giving a 3-hour lecture. I mean, I'd be fine, because like most academics, I'm happy with the sound of my own voice, but you might want to get to dinner. But also one has to realize the degree to which this is an incredibly personalistic court. And therefore, a lot of these people who matter, they matter because of their influence on Putin. Actually, take Putin away, and all of a sudden, they're just, old men, very rich old men in most cases, but nonetheless, old men who don't often have an institutional power base. Take, for example, Nikolai Patrushev, formerly Secretary of the Security Council, now presidential aide, incredibly powerful as a man who paints a picture of the outside world to Putin, and who frankly makes Putin look like a stable dove. But the point is he has no power base. If Putin disappears tomorrow, Patrushev is nowhere. So I think that's why it's still worth focusing on Putin himself, even if he is in some ways a rather grey, dull man. In terms of post-imperial, I mean, 2 points I'd make. First of all, my hope is that whatever happens in Ukraine, that basically it does not end up supporting Putin's narratives, but quite the opposite, it provides a shock. And it might be the equivalent of the Suez Crisis for Britain or the Algerian War for France, that point at which once great imperial power realizes that the world has moved on and it is no longer that, and has to start the process of coming to terms with it. Because the point is, Russia has never had to deal with its demons. It's always had alibis. 1917, all that bad stuff, no, that was the Tsars, not us. 1991, all that bad stuff, no, that was the communists, not us. So it's always had these alibis. This, although, yes, they can say it was Putin, not us, but basically this is Russia's sin. How historians deal with it? Look, I don't think Russian historians need tips from us. I think actually most Russian historians are good historians. They want to do proper history. It's just they operate within a context that makes it difficult and dangerous, and after a certain point, many of them kind of give in and think, oh, well, I'll write what I need to write. But I think without those constraints, I don't think that we'll have a problem with Russian historians not being able to write proper history about it, the empire.
And one very quick question from the front, and then we'll get some closing words from Stefan.
What are the differences and similarities between how Russia views Ukraine and how Putin views Ukraine and the policy in Ukraine and how he views Georgia?
Ukraine is totally different precisely because, as far as he's concerned, it is, well, at least half of it is basically Russia that Lenin gave away. As far as he's concerned, Lenin is the demon who actually created this independent Ukraine, and that's all Lenin, all on Lenin. So, and look, the fact is that if you look at the sort of most of the cities of Ukraine, the historical cities, they were once parts of the kind of community of the Rus people. Kiev was basically the most important city within the Rus sort of principalities. Georgia is totally different. Georgia has its own culture, its own language, its own script. I think from Putin's point of view, he has internalized the sense that there's a very big difference. Countries that actually have their own kind of historical identity that he recognizes, fine. He will want to, as a politician, he will want to bring pressure to bear on countries like Georgia. But it's not like he thinks that Georgia ought to be part of the Russian Federation in a way that it's much less clear. Ukraine, like Belarus, are different. He explicitly says that Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia are really all part of the same sort of early proto-state, in his view.
Wonderful. I think we've run out of time for questions, so if we get some closing words from Stefan.
Yes, as David briefly mentioned, I am Stefan and I'm the president of the History Society this year. And the big thing that me and the fantastic group of people that are in my committee this year have wanted to do is build back better, to coin a political term that you may remember from a couple of years ago, after COVID, and bring people back in. So it's really, really fantastic, not only to have Mark, and I thank you very much for a very fascinating talk, but also to see all of you here. So if you did enjoy today's talk as much as I did, and you want to hear more about the types of talks that we've got, we do have an Instagram account, Selwyn College History Society, and we do have a mailing list as well. So if you'd like to be put on the mailing list, if you just speak to me at the end, or if you speak to one of the members of the committee, be it David or David, two Davids, nice and easy for you to remember. So yes, thank you very much to Mark for coming. Thank you to all of you for coming, and I do hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you very much.